Hi, my name is Amaan Shaikh. I'm a consultant psychologist with Amaha, and today I'll be answering some questions on men's mental health. What are the biggest challenges men face when it comes to mental health? In today's society, there's many significant challenges that men face when it comes to mental health. I think the primary one would be lack of safe spaces. So, for me personally, a safe space would mean any space where one could express their emotions without the fear of judgment and could essentially be themselves without any hesitation. What happens with most men is they live under these expectations that are imposed on them by society, and that leads to many men suffering alone, often in solidarity without really knowing it. The second main challenge that comes to men when it comes to seeking help is the lack of awareness, because many men, even in today's world, don't really know about the resources that are available to them. Either it is due to a resistance or it is due to a certain expectation on them. But men end up not being able to ask for help and not being able to receive it when they need it the most. And finally, I would say there is a certain social expectation that is put on to men. There is this archetype of the macho man that automatically implies strength, that automatically does not allow him to be weak. And I think many men end up chasing that ideal consciously and subconsciously. And we live in a society where media, pop culture, tradition, all of it just reinforces this ideal to the point where even when a man feels like there is something wrong, there's something inside him constantly stopping him from getting that help he needs, or even acknowledging that there's a problem to begin with. How does cultural conditioning around masculinity affect men's ability to express emotions and seek help? So, the thing about culture and conditioning essentially is that these are big words that are used all the time, they're all around us. But in a way, they're also very invisible. And in a way, they express themselves in very small ways, right? So when we talk about conditioning, we think about it as this big machine that aims to control men all over. But sometimes it can be as small as a young boy crying and the parents saying, don't cry, because that's not what boys do. It can be being criticized for wearing the color pink. It can be being criticized for showing any amount of vulnerability or pain. Like I said earlier, it can be your heroes that you see in your movies, and it can be the figures that you look up to in media. And slowly but surely, when we grow up seeing these certain reinforcements, what happens to us is essentially conditioning. It's not really one big machine, but it's a series of tiny nudges that society constantly does to remind you what it is to be a man. For me, the biggest role of cultural conditioning is to separate men from others, unknowingly isolating men by convincing them that they have this constant need and constant standard to match up to of being strong, of being independent, of not needing anyone else. And what happens there is when men are constantly judged for showing vulnerability, they end up internalizing a lot of it, which means that when things ultimately do get bad and do get unmanageable, they are left with no direction to go, no willingness to seek help. And there's almost this internal conflict where they need help, but they're also not able to reach out and get it because the voice that stops them is also coming from within. What are some common misconceptions about men's mental health that need to be addressed? I think one of the most common misconceptions, especially seen in India, is that men don't struggle with mental health issues as much as women do, which actually has completely been disproven by the statistics. According to the Accidental Deaths and Suicides in India 2021 report by the NCRB, men actually make up 72.5% of suicide victims in this country, which is a staggering number compared to women. However, that report also stated that on the other hand, women are experiencing higher rates of depression and anxiety. And for me, this contradiction makes total sense because if you look at it, what this tells us is that even though women are experiencing higher rates of mental illness or mental health issues, they also have discovered more ways of coping, seeking help, receiving help, and even finding a way to express their emotions and need for help. While men who are not able to access these resources due to various reasons generally end up taking the route of externalization, either engaging in impulsive activity or substance use, risky behavior, or any activity that could ultimately be detrimental to their health. Another misconception that I've often seen people talk about is where I see many men talk about how they believe that they don't need to process their emotions. They're able to deal with their emotions very quickly. And often, what I see happening is these men live their lives in a solution focused approach with the belief that I don't need to feel my feelings. I've already found the solution and moved on. With time, although, what I've also realized is that people who move on too quick without processing their emotions will experience certain consequences of unprocessed emotion. Either the emotions coming out via stress, or there could be emotions coming out via unrelated aggression. But no matter what the medium is, what we do find is that when we do ignore the process of processing, there are always consequences, and sometimes those consequences affect those nearest to us. The final misconception that I think I've learned is that men live with this idea that expressing or accepting your vulnerability makes you weak. And this has been an age old debate where emotional vulnerability has been equated to weakness. There's also this fear that if I become weak, if I let my guard down, who will take care of those around me? And for me personally, in my experience and practice, I've realized the real question comes down to what sort of a member do we want to be in our family's lives? What sort of a loved one would we like to be for those around us? Would we like to be someone who's strong but half there? Would we like to be someone who's so obsessed with the powerfulness of it all that they're refusing to show their vulnerability and realness? Or would we maybe like to also treat those around us as equals, offer them maybe a window into our hearts, and build real relationships that are not really based on roles and hierarchies, but just some sort of authenticity? When stress builds up, I find myself becoming irritable and losing my temper, especially at home. I don't want to be that guy who can't control his anger. What can I do to handle my stress better? So, to begin with, I would like to acknowledge that it is completely normal to feel stress, and also very normal to take account and know when you're reaching your limits. So, if anyone feels that they're in this situation, the first thing I would say is the fact that you are able to be cognizant and acknowledge your limits already puts you in a better position compared to most. Personally, when it comes to stress, what I would really try to advise is to firstly identify a root cause of stress. And this is a process that may require complete transparency, but it is something that is very rewarding in the long run. Understanding what are the areas of my life that cause me stress, that build up, and over time lead to this burden on me would really help me figure out how to deal with it in the future. The next step would probably be stress management techniques. However, I also know that stress management techniques don't always work in a vacuum. So, while I would suggest the usual meditation, hobbies, spending time with your loved ones, special attention on sleep and appetite, I also would say that stress management is sort of a lifestyle change. And while we may not be able to completely transform our lifestyle overnight, what helps is trying to look at where we can start. What are the building blocks I can slowly incorporate into my life to try to give myself a bit more leeway? When it comes to anger or any other explosion of emotion, what we also realize is that this doesn't happen momentarily. This isn't a switch that flips. Often, what happens is this is a build up that has been happening for a long time. Personally, what I believe is just tuning into ourselves, being more aware of what our sensations and patterns are, and maybe taking note of that build up, trying to be aware of what are all the areas where it slowly creeps up on us, and maybe catch it before it takes over us, might be the key to managing stress and also ensuring that it doesn't lead to aggression. When I was younger, I lost a close family member, and I think it still impacts me today. But as a man, we're expected to move on. How can I start processing this without feeling judged? Loss is a deeply personal experience, and it's one that stays with you for a long time. But in my experience, men have to also deal with this added burden of feeling the loss of a loved one, feeling the impact of a loved one passing away or leaving, and then also being made to feel guilty about expressing that emotion. It's almost like there is this urgency where men are expected to quickly move on and just suppress everything they're feeling and just show up for everybody else and take on that responsibility. If you are at a position where you're able to acknowledge the need for help, firstly, I would like to say that is a very big step to take. How can we process loss? I don't know if there is a set pattern. I don't know if there is a set solution or a series of steps we can do to figure our emotions out. But what I do know is that whatever decision we take, it always starts with the first step of acknowledging your emotions. I think what I always try to tell my clients is that our emotions are not in our control. They come from within us, but we don't choose them. All we can do is acknowledge the reality of our emotions. And the first step towards processing loss would be just acknowledging the pain that is already there. Next, what I think always helps is finding a safe space to be able to express that loss, to be able to express that grief, to be able to express the impact it's had on you. I don't always believe therapy is the only place to go. Sometimes just sharing your emotions with a trusted friend, with a safe person in a non judgmental space could always help. But at the same time, therapy is always an option. If you'd like to share it in a safe space with a trained professional with zero connection to your life and zero judgment from our side. I know nobody wants to feel bad. Nobody enjoys feeling pain. And sometimes that's the reason why we run from it, because it is so distressing and it is just too much to bear. But what I also know is that our feelings are meant to be felt. There is no way to work around them. There is no shortcuts through this, unfortunately. What I believe is the only way out is through. And while that does sound very inconvenient, I think it's just as rewarding. A big part of loss is grief, which comes from the love we had for someone. And I would say the best way to honor the love you had for someone would be to acknowledge the pain of their absence. So while I think any safe space would always work, therapy is always a space you will be welcome to. The idea of being unemotional and stoic is often tied to being an alpha, but I find myself bottling things up, which feels unhealthy. How can I address my emotions without feeling like I'm breaking character? I know it can often seem tough to reconcile this pressure of being stoic with the need to be vulnerable and to just let out these bottled up emotions. Personally, for me, I've never seen stoicism and vulnerability as two sides of the same coin, because for me, vulnerability has never equated to weakness. I think most men, whether they like it or not, do experience emotions. And the stoicism may often come from a space of wanting to run from those emotions, to want to deflect or distract themselves from it. And that's what leads to that bottling up. To me, strength has always meant doing that which is difficult and doing it nonetheless. And in a world where men are criticized for being vulnerable, men are labeled for showing their emotions, men are forced to bottle up everything that's within, true strength would mean taking a stand for everything that's within and allowing yourself to experience the reality of your situation. So while I do acknowledge that it may be hard to let go of that stoic archetype, that idealistic standard you've set for yourself, sometimes I also believe it is very liberating to not live a character but to be able to live what you're really feeling. I've built my life around the idea of being an alpha who doesn't struggle, but now I'm facing challenges I can't ignore. How do I reconcile this mindset with the need to care for my mental health? To begin with, it's a funny story about the alpha theory itself. It wasn't originally made for human beings. It was a theory proposed by Dr. Robert Greene for the behavior of wolves. And the alpha wolf was supposed to be this leader who walked alone and survived without the help of anyone else. However, 25 years after the original theory, the same Dr. Robert Greene came back to debunk his theory, stating that he was mistaken and there was no alpha in the forest. All there was the pack. When we look at men being forced to fit into this archetype of the alpha who never feels pain, who never seeks help, who never shows vulnerability, I'm always amazed by the sheer intensity of the standard you're setting up young boys to grow into. I'm always amazed because I've always seen people talk about being alpha. I've never really seen anyone who's benefiting from it. At the end of the day, I've never seen human society survive on pure individuality or self obsession. That seems to be something that we've developed in these past few years. What I've always believed, though, is that we survive on our inherent sense of community. What I believe is that people need people. Even as alphas, all we as men have been conditioned to do, and what I believe most men are just trying to do, is stay strong for their families, for their loved ones. Even within that need to be an alpha, there is an inherent care and love for those around us. Even within that need to not be vulnerable, there is an inherent love and care for the responsibility we have to hold for the people that depend on us. And that doesn't seem like very lone wolf to me. That seems like someone who knows the importance of community, who believes in being there for the people around them, and who believes in the fact that all of us do need each other at some level. I know it can be hard to break out of these boxes we've been put in. I know it can be hard to reconcile with the fact that we may be strong, but we may also need help. But like I said before, true strength is not about not having any bad days. It's about being able to acknowledge when you do and go through the lows and highs as they come. To seek help when you need it. To be able to allow someone else to lend a hand, just like you have always. I know it can be hard to break yourself out of that box, especially when the men around us sometimes may be the most critical. However, I think a place to start is self acknowledgement. Before being compassionate to ourselves, maybe what we first need to do is just see ourselves for what we are, accept what really is. And maybe, with time, with small steps, we could also learn to acknowledge our vulnerabilities and sometimes ask for that helping hand when we need it.